Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Yes, this is Taji Ra'oof Nahl, also known as TR7. We're here at the Trip in the Pearl studio in Philadelphia, Philly. What can I say? This is where it goes down at. The video footage, the conceptualization of the soundscapes, the sculptures, everything is manipulated right here, activated right here. It's really an anomaly. It was me morphing into it. You know, one of my concepts is called morphological. You know, I started out as a gallerist, and back in the early 2000s, late 90s, early 2000s, I had my first art gallery in Center City, Philadelphia, and with the section they call Old City. And there, I featured a lot of artists. One of my good friends, Terry Atkins, another artist, and this other artist has passed as well, Jay Camp. And when the crash of 2008 came, you know, my gallery couldn't sustain itself, so I closed down. And then I tried to open again in 2009, and we moved to Chestnut Street, 20th and Chestnut, Rittenhouse Square section.
Theo Van Doesburg, the father of the Still movement circa 1930.
We stayed there roughly 9 or 10 months, and then we closed down. However, from that, I had all this clothing that I had duplicates of, vintage clothing and what have you. You know, people say they like my style so much, so my wife said, why don't you sell some of the clothing that you have to help supplement the income that's not coming in? And one thing led to another. I started selling the clothing, and I would take certain clothing apart. You know, I'll find a nice cashmere coat, and it had, you know, holes in it from moths or whatever, eating at it. So instead of just getting rid of that beautiful coat, maybe it was by Burberry or it was from the 1960s, and I'll take the sleeves off of it, and then I'll put leather sleeves on it. So I started doing all this clothing, and that became my fashion brand called Animated Man. From Animated Man, I couldn't just say, put this on, you the model, take the shot. I had to have a narrative. So by me giving narratives and storylines to the clothing and what it was about, the storylines and the narratives took over, and I was like, the wardrobe was secondary. And so that's, long story short, but how I got into doing installation work, sculptures and assemblage and the likes in the photography.
He seemed to be present in all the first-person accounts, like the artists all talking about him, you know, Jordan Jones, Emmett Williams, they're all talking about Ben Patterson.
In the midst of that, by me already being in the art world as a gallerist, and I used to do work when I was younger, you know, when I was in my teenager, and when I decided I was going to go to college, I wanted to be a journalist. Art was not in the picture. I wanted to be a journalist. So, but when I got in school, my professors were discouraging me, and from the other side of me being an entrepreneur, that spirit took over. I was like, forget this whole, school stuff. I'm not getting no real support here for what I want to do. And I pursued being an entrepreneur, selling things. And then in the midst of all of that, I started selling artwork a little bit here and there. And then over time, it developed until I got my own gallery, or 20 years later. I've always had art in my life. So in terms of inspiration, Alexander Calder, Isma Noguchi, these were big influences in my early days, as growing up. And of all the periods, I'm big on 20th century design furnishings. And that's another venture there. Because my art gallery was a blend, or what they say now, mashup of abstract art and modern furniture. And I was one of the first in Philadelphia to do so. But the art scenario, by my artistic inclinations, it was very important how things were placed. So people would come in and say, like, this one art collector said, like, you're an artist. And I'm the gallerist. This is my gallery. And people would say to me, I said, well, yeah, I used to do stuff when I was younger, but, that never took off. So when my gallery closed and then I moved into the clothing, all this stuff started coming out. And then, now the influences, then I had a good friend that I met when I was in my gallery, a gentleman by the name of Terry Atkins, who has since passed. May he rest in peace and God have mercy on his soul. Terry came in my gallery one year, it was like 2001, and we immediately bonded. It was like, kindred spirits. And he was into mid-century design, and I got into his artwork. And then I started showing his artwork and collected it, and his influence in our friendship was like, yeah, Terry, you reminded me, like, I really need to let this out. And I had one of my concepts right now called Renaissance Report Live. That was a concept that really was birthed back in 2006. But Renaissance Report Live came from Terry Atkins, Jamaluddin Takuma, who was my other friend, who called herself, I used to call us the Three Amigos. So we was going to do mid-century design furnishing, fine art, and music. And that's what Renaissance Report Live is now. The idea of men with different disciplines and highlighting those disciplines and how they work together. I'll tell you, I have to say this, that a lot of artists that I have collaborated with, and I love collaboration because it's the curator in me, from being a gallerist. So I'm always out seeking and looking and curious about other people's work, and then how I can be a part of that some kind of way. I would hear from a lot of young artists that like just getting their chops wet in terms of creating, out of art school or what have you, or even seasoned people who's like 40 years old, and they're looking at like, Taji, you've done so much work. Yeah, body of work. And I'm like, I had to look at it. I'm like, preparing for that interview the other day. It was like I've done like over 100 short films. The subject matter and what it's about, they're all unique in their own, lane, and they have their own validity to them. So that's just the film side, let alone my sculptures and my activations, and people I've collaborated with. And it was like the average person, it might take them 20 years to do what I did. And I've done it in 10 years. And I'm like, and this is other artists telling me this. I'm not aware. I just know I love what I do, and I'm like, I'm ready to go in. What's going to be next? So, and that's my spirit. I'm hungry. I'm like, I want to create. I wake up creating. The story about Jamaluddin, Takuma, and Terry Atkins getting together was, at the time, this is like 2001, 2002, Terry and I become friends, and Terry found out that, Jamaluddin Takuma was my friend. So Terry said, Taj, hook me up with Jamaluddin, because we was on an album together. I think the guy's name was Harris, Eddie Harris. I forget the name of the album, but so Terry and Terry knew about Jamal's music, but Jamaluddin didn't know about Terry. He didn't know Terry as an artist or anything. So Jamal was like, "Who's this Terry Atkins guy you trying to hook me up with?" I'm like, "He's an artist and he's good, da 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 da, right?" So, and Terry told me y'all was on an album together. So eventually, we all connect, and then, how you say, happily ever after, we became best friends. So I called us the Three Amigos, so, and then eventually, after some time, Terry and Jamal actually worked on a record together, and I believe Jamaluddin put that out. I'm not sure, but that was some crazy stuff.
We're not scared of the monsters. We're not scared of the monsters. You're not scared of the monsters. That big C-O-B. You're not scared of the monsters. My mama told me about them years ago. She said, that monster hiding under your bed. Why don't you give him some of your cornbread?
I would do, it's the Microfilm Festival accompanied with the live soundtrack scoring session. And the live soundtrack scoring session is, get some musicians, be it one or be a duet or be a trio or quartet or whatever. We'll come and we'll score, we'll play to the mood of the music. And then I would narrate live, like in the whole hip hop game, they sing with freestyle, and a hip hop artist, you say, you throw a term at him, and then they'll have to rhyme off that term, off the top of his head. So with that spirit, to weave the narration.
Oil of oregano.
So that's the two components of the Microfilm Festival with the live soundtrack scoring session. And the origin of this, where this idea came from initially to do this, was at my gallery when I was on 3rd Street, to always have art happenings. Philadelphia had this scenario. First Friday of every month, the gallery would stay open late. So I always had to do something. So be an artist talk or have some music or whatever. And my place was like a hub. People used to just come, just hang out. Don't buy nothing, just hang out. But in the midst of that, one gentleman I invited named Tom Spiker, he was doing this thing called the Mobile Pleasure Lounge. And the Mobile Pleasure Lounge was one video projection on one of the walls, and it was a montage. So he'll take it from a clip from a horror movie, The Shining or The Blob, to Beach Blanket Bingo, to, scenes from The Godfather, whatever. And he would just put this hodgepodge of film footage together, and it'd be like 30 seconds, another 40 seconds, then maybe a minute, and then the band would play to that music. To those films. And that's where I got the idea from. I'm like, I love this. And then I took that and then I made it my own and expounded on it. So once again, something that happened in 2004, I utilized that experience, remembered it some kind of way. I don't know what was my prompting, but 2014, 2015, Microfilm Festivals kicks off. So my project around Benjamin Banneker, the polymath, African-American artist from the 1700s, who was an astronomer, farmer, mathematician, author of an almanac, land surveyor. He did trees on bees, and also on a 17-year locust. And when I discovered Banneker, I knew about him growing up, but just like anybody else, they get lost in the mix. So I went to go do a project at Rittenhouse Soundworks, which is not too far from here in Germantown section of Philadelphia.
I want you to go through the whole chorus.
It was a site-responsive piece. So I asked the guy who owned the place, Jim Hamilton, tell me about, Rittenhouse, what Rittenhouse Street is, and the history of it. And so he's a pseudo historian himself, and he explains to me about David Rittenhouse was an astronomer. He was head of the Philadelphia Astronomy Society, and their family was quite wealthy, and they owned a lot of land, et cetera, et cetera. I'm like, David Rittenhouse, okay, that's cool. So how can I find myself in what that was? Just running through some article, creative researching, and I found that Benjamin Banneker had sent some calculations to David Rittenhouse, asked him if they were correct. From that inception of finding that little nugget of information grew into this massive grant project that I've done where I mined the works of Banneker in different abstract forms. So this particular piece, the experiment, born from him being the landowner of a tobacco farm. And on his tobacco farm, he found that tobacco is bad for your health. It was 100 years before the Surgeon General told anybody about some cigarette smoking is bad for you. Benjamin Banneker, information in his almanac.
Trace my ancestors' footsteps down the living furrows of my planting, yielding heavy, our crops are refreshed by good practice.
The Black Death, this sculpture here, came from the FBI. They said, if you're in the field and you're surveying Malcolm X, who they call the Black Messiah, Paul Robeson, Elizabeth Catlett, Huey P. Newton, Fred Hampton, bring that information and we're going to bring it to the Black Desk. That's what they would call it. So, and how we find out about the COINTEL program was because of this burglary. Back in 1970-71, a burglary took place at the FBI building in Media, Pennsylvania. These anti-war activists broke in, and them finding this information, they said, wait a minute, what is all this about these different African American figures? So they contacted this writer for the Washington Post, and then that woman, she put out the book called The Burglary. I highly recommend you get this book. And that was the exposure of the whole COINTEL program. And so this is my piece, and I've done a whole series of body of work called The Black Death. This is actually a film short series where I take my artistic license and I deal with what the COINTEL program has done to the African American. And so this is the actual physical sculpture of this. I've been dealing with the Black Death for like 6-7 years.
Even when we try to spend our money on the block where we live or in the area where we live, we're spending our money with a man who, when the sun goes down, takes that basket full of money to another part of town. So we're trapped, double trapped, triple trapped. Everywhere we go, we find that we're trapped. And any solution that anybody ever comes up with is just another trap. But the economic philosophy of black nationalism.
Assalamu alaikum. How are you, brother? The FBI had people
Had itself piped in and they knew
We're gonna move in. Alright, so I'm just waiting on
going
the
to
call.
rendezvous with Bobby Seals. You make sure you got your name on
provided by
that.
the CIA.
They hear everything. Here's
I'm
the call
going to
right here.
Malcolm.
And then they're talking to Agent Johnson. What do you see? Is everything in focus? They have to get this shot. So the Black Desk COINTEL program is still going on today.
Africa, Sudan, all of West Africa. Wherever there's Negroes, he's uniting them. Alright, and that's what the black Muslims are doing here. He's bringing it global.
Lives are being surveilled right now because we're in a surveillance state.
Please,
Everywhere you go, there are cameras.
please.
Everywhere you go, they're documenting what you're doing. You're not an unwilling subject or a willing subject, doesn't matter. Whether they ask for your permission or not, they got you on camera. This sculpture here will be activated in conjunction with another sculpture called Caged Domestics the prequel, which also was done in 2021 in a response to the African Americans, Native Americans, the Indians, the Polish, the Scottish, the people from Indonesia, the caged domestics from around the world, because we were all caged in.
Good evening. From the Patriot Act to mandatory stabbings to blockchain biometric surveillance in a digitized matrix, we're at the dawn of the new slavery movement. A very small portion of the population are moving and trying as hard as they can to enslave the majority. Will you be an abolitionist? Will you resist the technocracy and its mark? Will you help and develop the Underground Railroad? Will you be Nat Turner or William Wallace? Or will Harriet have to leave you behind? They fill in human veins with iron while trying to humanize the robots. Stab the sheep.
One of the things we want to look for is hydrogel, graphene oxide, different nanoparticles. You know, we want to have to get specific microscopes to look at the nanoparticles, because what we have can't see those. But I know a friend that has a lab that we can use, get higher concentrations. That they have those, you know, $1 million microscopes. Right. Because that's what you need to see.
Soaked with rains, gently turn to good work. The earth praises me with abundance as I feed her with new seeds each year. Listen with me for the buzzing things that fly. Honor the winged workers who reopen the buds with each new season. Prepare for the sleepers who emerge like clockwork from the earth. Know the world as a living spear, and it will sing for you. Polymath, Benjamin Banneker. We honor you. Your legacy stands true.
Equality within. Good character